I sat by the window of a small coffee shop across from NetGlide's Manhattan headquarters, hands curled around a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea, outside. The winter light bounced off the glass facade of the tower, fractured by the flashing lights of police cars and the idle hum of news vans parked at the curb. I watched employees shuffle in and out with pale faces, shoulders hunched, phones pressed to their ears. From here, the building that had once felt like my second home now looked like a wounded giant. My phone buzzed against the tabletop. I glanced down and saw the email subject line in bold, red emergency outage, all billing suspended, where, for a moment, I just stared. The words hovering like a headline from a world I'd already left behind. My chest tightened, not with shock, but with the cold satisfaction of inevitability. I had known this day was coming, the moment they showed me the door. 6 weeks earlier, I'd stood in HR's carpeted room on the 32nd floor, a cardboard box waiting by my feet. Across the desk sat Ethan Langford, the CEO's 27-year-old son, grinning with the easy confidence of someone who had never written a line of production code in his life. "Camille," he said, leaning back in the chair his father's name had earned him. "We've reviewed your modules. Frankly, this bad code is holding the company back. It's time to modernize." Bad code. That was his summary of 12 years of work, of late nights spent perfecting the currency normalization system that quietly handled billions in transactions, moving money between Tokyo, London, and New York without a single critical failure. My team and I had been the invisible backbone of NetGlide, the reason clients trusted their finances to us without question. But to Ethan, it was just legacy clutter in the way of his vision. I remembered gripping the edge of the chair, forcing myself to stay composed as HR slid the severance paperwork across the table. I signed in silence, knowing any words would be wasted. On the elevator ride down, I whispered to myself, they just unplugged the only thing keeping the company alive, back in the coffee shop. I closed the email and took another slow sip of tea. The sirens outside mingled with the distant honk of taxis, the city moving on. Unaware of the chaos blooming behind that glass facade, I leaned back in my chair, watching the first cracks in their empire appear, and thought of the moment Ethan first smiled at me across that sterile HR desk. And the real storm, I knew, was only beginning. The memory of that all-hands meeting was etched into my mind as clearly as the Manhattan skyline outside our 22nd floor conference room. Sunlight poured through the glass walls, reflecting off Times Square billboards, while the engineering team sat in a stiff semicircle around the long table. Most of us had been with NetGlide for years. Some had grown gray here. We were the quiet machinery behind billions of dollars moving safely through our clients' systems. And in front of us stood Ethan Langford, his designer suit as crisp as his grin, holding a sleek tablet like it was a scepter. "NetGlide is entering a new era," he declared, his voice echoing off the glass. A slide flickered onto the wall, 90-day system modernization. Neon blue arrows promised progress. Diagrams of clean microservices bloomed like flowers. He clicked through a flurry of buzzwords: CI/CD pipelines, AI code analysis, serverless architecture, his voice rising with every term. Then came the twist. "To accelerate this transformation," he said, pausing for effect, "I've signed a contract with Refactor AI. Their proprietary engine will automatically clean and optimize our legacy code, eliminating the inefficiencies holding us back." He looked so proud of himself that a few new hires even clapped. I raised my hand. "Ethan, our legacy system isn't just code. It's the company's heartbeat. It handles 17 currencies, each with its own decimal and regulatory quirks. Japan doesn't use decimals. While parts of Europe swap commas and periods, one misinterpretation can send millions to the wrong account. That complexity isn't inefficiency, it's protection. He tilted his head, smirked, and spoke with the casual cruelty of someone who had never watched a real system fail. Camille, if it can't be explained in a slide, it's bad code. The future doesn't have room for spaghetti like that. Around the table, a few engineers shifted in their seats but said nothing. The weight of his last name pressed against the room like a closing door. I lowered my hand and leaned back, letting his neon arrows flash past, each one another nail in a coffin he couldn't see. By the time the meeting ended, I knew the countdown to disaster had already begun. The office was nearly silent that night, just the hum of the HVAC and the distant wail of a siren from the streets below. The skyline reflected off the glass walls, a shimmering reminder that New York never truly slept, even if my career here had just been put to bed. HR had delivered the news with the same polite detachment I'd seen in dozens of layoffs over the years. A folder slid across the table, 6-month severance, extended health benefits, and the usual NDA and non-disparagement clause. I signed without hesitation. Words wouldn't change the decision. Ethan's last name had already made it irreversible. Back at my desk, I opened the drawers that had once held my life. A faded photo of my first team in that scrappy Brooklyn warehouse. A coffee mug chipped on one side from too many late nights. 12 years of loyalty and invisible labor reduced to a cardboard box that felt far too light. Before logging out for the last time, I opened my private notes folder. It wasn't company property, just my own documentation diagrams of the currency normalization bridge, explanations of every strange edge case, and the hidden logic behind messy code. It was the map of landmines that only I could read. Quietly, I copied it to an encrypted drive and deleted the originals from the shared space. I had no interest in revenge, but I wasn't going to leave my knowledge behind for people who thought a slide deck could replace experience. On my way out, I paused by the server room. Behind that door, the code I had written was still running, moving billions of dollars across 17 currencies without a hiccup. I placed my hand on the cold metal handle and whispered to myself, "They don't even realize they just pulled the pin." I rode the elevator down to the lobby with my small box and walked into the crisp night air. The city buzzed around me, oblivious, but I could already feel the quiet tremor of what was coming. Within weeks, the cracks would spread, and the first signs of collapse would appear for everyone to see. 18 days after I walked out of NetGlide for the last time, I found myself strolling through Flushing Meadows Park. The February air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of roasted nuts from a nearby cart. I wrapped my fingers around a paper cup of coffee, letting the warmth seep into my palms, and stopped by the edge of the lake, where the city skyline shimmered in the distance. My phone buzzed with a notification. Out of habit, I opened Reddit, and there it was, a thread exploding in our software gore. NetGlide charged me $0.01 for a $999 subscription. The screenshot showed a pristine invoice with a single cent in the total. Below it, another user chimed in, "Lucky you, I just got billed $10,000 for a $100 service." Support is silent. Dozens of replies poured in, half in panic, half in disbelief. I scrolled further, finding the same chaos mirrored on Twitter screenshots, angry tags, and memes of flaming dollar bills. Some joked about free subscriptions for life. Others swore they were contacting lawyers. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter warmth spread through me. It wasn't joy. Not exactly. More like a quiet recognition that gravity always wins. The logic was simple. My messy currency normalization bridge had been the invisible glue holding 17 currencies together. Japanese yen with no decimals, European transactions with commas where Americans used periods, edge cases where banks processed cents differently depending on the day of the month. It was ugly code because the world itself was ugly. Clean slides and AI refactors couldn't change that. By now, their gleaming microservices were misreading decimals, flipping digits, and producing numbers that belonged in casino jackpots rather than financial ledgers. And the best part, or worst, depending on how you looked at it, was that I hadn't touched a thing. I hadn't sabotaged, planted a bug, or written a single malicious line. All I'd done was leave and let arrogance do the rest. A gust of wind rippled the lake, and I watched a gull dip low over the water. Somewhere across the river, alarms were blaring, phones were ringing, and I knew the first real calls of desperation would come soon. 3 days later, I was in Midtown, walking past the bright digital tickers that wrapped around the buildings like electric ribbons. Between the flashing ads and stock prices, one headline repeated in bold, red NetGlide stock plunges 40%. Below it, a financial network scrolled an endless loop of sound bites. Global billing chaos at NetGlide Systems, one anchor said as footage of the glass tower I once worked in filled the screen. A second voice added, 3 enterprise clients have already terminated their contracts, and 7 more have suspended service until the errors are resolved. I stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the city noise blur into a distant hum. The company I had poured 12 years into was unraveling faster than I'd even predicted. The elegant, invisible engine I had built had been replaced with hollow promises, and now the entire financial world was watching it fail. That night, I opened my laptop and logged into LinkedIn, a habit I hadn't indulged since leaving. My inbox was stacked with messages. Most were from recruiters sensing opportunity, but a few were from familiar names. One caught my eye, Zoe Alvarez, a junior developer who had once smiled politely during Ethan's all-hands show. Camille, I think we broke it. Nobody knows how decimals work anymore. The system is charging random amounts, and every fix makes something else worse. I wish we'd listened. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the blinking cursor. I didn't type a reply. There was nothing to say that reality wasn't already teaching her. Another alert popped up, news of yet another client going public with their outrage. Shareholders were starting to call for heads. I closed my laptop and set it aside, the faint city lights flickering across my living room. The air felt heavy, not with guilt, but with the weight of inevitability. I didn't need to move a finger. Their pride was dismantling everything for me. All I had to do now was wait for the call I knew was coming. I sat on my couch that evening, the city lights washing through my apartment windows. The TV on the wall was muted, but the red banners screamed their story anyway. NetGlide down 48%. Clients abandon ship. A small video box showed a reporter standing outside the glass tower I used to walk into every morning. The same revolving doors I had passed with a cardboard box in my hands. My phone vibrated on the coffee table. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew exactly who it would be. Camille Dawson. I answered. A pause. Then a voice I recognized, Richard Mercer, the CFO. I could almost hear exhaustion crackling through the line. Camille, we need you to save us. Name your price. I let the silence stretch for a moment, watching the muted chaos on TV. 5 times my old salary, I said finally. Paid monthly, in advance. He didn't argue. Done. Full control of the fix. No interference from management. Another pause. Then a weary. Yes. Ethan Langford is out. He doesn't step into the room, doesn't touch a line of code, doesn't even send me a message. That time, the silence was heavier. I could almost see him pinching the bridge of his nose on the other end. All right, I'll handle it. One more thing. Any code I write is mine. NetGlide gets a perpetual license, but the IP stays with me. That's not standard. Neither is losing half your market cap in 3 weeks because someone erased the system that kept you alive, I said calmly. The line was silent again, and then came a sigh that sounded like surrender. Fine. Whatever it takes, just get us out of this nightmare. Send me the contract tonight, I said. I'll step into that office tomorrow, and I won't write a single line until it's signed. I ended the call and set the phone down, letting the quiet settle around me in the corner. The TV flickered with images of angry shareholders and endless headlines, and I knew that tomorrow I would walk back into that building on entirely different terms. The next morning, I stepped through the revolving doors of NetGlide headquarters, and for the first time, no one stopped me. Security nodded, already briefed on my return, and I rode the elevator in silence. The building felt different. Once sleek and confident, it now hummed with the frantic energy of survival. And on the 22nd floor, I walked past conference rooms converted into makeshift dorms. Blankets were draped over chairs. Energy drink cans lined the windowsills, and a sour mix of stale coffee and exhaustion hung in the air. A few engineers looked up as I entered the war room, their eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. Zoe Alvarez stood among them, her face pale and drawn. She gave me a small, hesitant nod. Regret was written in every line of her posture. I set my bag down and began without ceremony. This is why the old system worked, I said, pulling up a diagram of the currency normalization bridge on the projector. 17 currencies, each with different decimal conventions. Multiple banking systems that don't agree on how to interpret cents. Regulatory quirks that can change mid-year. None of this is pretty. That's why the code wasn't pretty. As I spoke, heads leaned closer. Pens scratched across notepads. I walked them through the logic how a Japanese yen transaction without decimals could break a European system that expected them, how a misplaced comma could turn 100 into 10,000, how years of exceptions had become a living map of survival. When I glanced up, Zoe's eyes met mine. In that look, I saw both shame and relief. She was finally beginning to understand that messy had always meant tested by reality. I continued for hours, explaining the invisible architecture that had carried them for over a decade, letting the weight of the lesson settle in the room. By the time I paused, the engineers were silent, absorbing the truth their slides and refactoring tools had never shown them. I picked up a marker and turned to the whiteboard, ready to outline the steps to rebuild what arrogance had torn apart. The war room buzzed with a nervous energy as I settled in at a borrowed workstation, dual monitors illuminating the whiteboard covered in half-erased diagrams. Outside the glass wall, the lights of Times Square flashed like a restless pulse, a reminder that the city kept moving even as NetGlide teetered on the edge. I opened the staging environment and began rebuilding the currency normalization bridge from scratch. My fingers moved with a calm precision that came only from muscle memory and years of understanding the system's quirks. Line by line, I wrote functions to handle decimal placement, regulatory exceptions, and those maddening regional edge cases, the ones no AI tool could ever guess. Behind me, the engineers whispered, watching over my shoulder as if they were witnessing surgery. I explained each segment as I went, annotating the code with detailed comments. This block handles cross-border yen transactions, I said, pointing to a nested condition without it. A $100 payment could become $10,000 or a single cent, depending on the receiving bank's rules. 3 hours later, I pushed the first test build to the staging environment. Run the test transactions, I instructed. The room held its collective breath as Zoe initiated the batch, one by one. The results appeared precise. flawless amounts across all 17 currencies. It worked. She whispered, then louder. It worked. A ripple of cheers filled the room, weary engineers clapping and high-fiving with the giddy relief of people who had been living on caffeine and panic for weeks. I simply nodded, saving the documentation and uploading my comments to the private archive I now controlled. Relief was for those who hadn't seen this coming. The room went quiet when the door opened. Harrison Langford stepped in, silver hair neatly combed, but his face tight with exhaustion and the weight of humiliation. His eyes swept the team before landing on me. "Ms. Dawson," he said, voice low but firm, a word, alone. I logged out of the terminal, rose from my chair, and followed him toward a small glass office down the hall. Knowing the real conversation was only just beginning, Harrison closed the glass door behind us, sealing out the murmur of engineers and the faint echo of Times Square below. He stood for a moment, hands clasped behind his back, looking at the city like he was searching for words among the lights. "Richard has briefed me," he said finally, his voice low, "about the outage, about your contributions, and about the terms you negotiated." I leaned against the edge of the table, letting the silence stretch. "My son," he continued, each word measured, "made a grave error. He removed critical components of your system without understanding their purpose. I allowed him too much latitude." He inhaled slowly. "I want to offer you a permanent senior role executive level. With appropriate authority and compensation, this company needs you." It would have been easy to say yes. For years, I'd lived in these hallways, guarding systems no one saw but everyone relied on. Yet the memory of Ethan smirking in that all-hands meeting and the polite HR voice reading from the severance script still lingered. "I'm not coming back as an employee," I said. His brows drew together. "You've proven your value. Why refuse?" "Because the problem here isn't just a line of code," I said evenly. "It's a culture that values buzzwords over reality. That hands power to family instead of experience, and that discards the people holding the place together because their work isn't shiny." Harrison's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. I pushed away from the table and met his eyes. "Next time, ask why code exists before erasing it." The words hung in the air like a gavel strike. He nodded once. "Slowly, Ethan will be moving to business development, effective immediately. He will have no technical authority." I felt no triumph, only the steady release of a weight I hadn't realized I'd carried. My work had spoken for itself as I stepped out of the glass office. The engineers glanced up, and Zoe's eyes met mine with something that looked like gratitude. I walked past them, my steps lighter than they had been in years, ready to leave this building on my own terms. I returned to my apartment in Queens as the last glow of sunset stretched across the skyline. The city lights flickered to life, each window a tiny pulse of energy against the quiet of my living room. I slipped off my coat and set my phone on the counter, letting the stillness settle in. For the first time in weeks, I felt no tension in my chest, no weight pressing against my ribs. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the F train snake through the city like a silver thread. My victory hadn't come from sabotage or gloating. It had come from the simple truth that I could walk away richer, freer, and with my value acknowledged in ways a paycheck alone could never show. I had turned years of invisible labor into leverage, and for once, I had chosen myself in the days that followed. I began to map out a new path. I'd received consulting offers before, but now I understood the power of what I carried, knowledge that couldn't be bought in a slide deck or replicated by an AI tool. I drafted the framework for a practice dedicated to helping companies preserve institutional memory, protect critical systems, and avoid the arrogance that had almost sunk NetGlide. One evening, as I reviewed my notes, an email notification appeared. It was from Zoe. "I'll never dismiss messy code again. Thank you for showing me what really keeps a system alive." I smiled to myself, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my legacy wasn't just a fixed system or a lucrative contract. It was the seed of understanding planted in someone who would carry it forward. I turned back to the window, the skyline shimmering in the distance, and whispered to the empty room. Some code looks messy. Some people seem invisible, but they're the ones holding the world together until someone decides to learn the hard way.